A Journey to the Center of the Earth, Chapter 2, Starting the Journey. It didn't take long for my uncle to take a book of maps from the shelf in order to explain Sakisum's message to me. You see, the whole island is composed of volcanoes, he said as he pointed to a map of Iceland, and they all bear the name Jökull, which means glacier in Icelandic. But what does the word Sneffels mean? I asked. I knew you would ask, my uncle answered. Follow my finger to the western coast, past Iceland's capital, Reykjavik. I followed his finger. There, he continued, that peninsula, shaped like a thigh bone with a mountain in the center. Do you see it? I had to admit that I did. That is Sneffels, he said with some satisfaction. It is a 5,000-foot high mountain which shall be our doorway to the center of the earth. Impossible, I cried. Why? The professor asked. Because its crater is probably choked with lava, with burning rocks, and with many dangers. Suppose it's extinct, he said. That it has been dead for many years. That would make a difference, I admitted. But what is all this about Scartaris and the Kalends of July? This shows how much Sakisum knew about the area, my uncle answered. The Sneffels mountain has 2 peaks and many craters. Sakisum is careful to point out the exact peak and crater. He lets us know that at the end of June the sun is positioned in the heavens so that the shadow of Mount Scartaris, one of the peaks, falls upon only one crater. That is our highway to the center of the earth. But the theories about the heat, I began. I care nothing for theories, my uncle answered loudly. Neither you nor anyone else really knows anything about the interior of the earth. The only way to learn its secrets is to go and see for ourselves. I left the professor and went to see Gretchen, my uncle's goddaughter and the girl I hoped to marry. Though my uncle had warned me to say nothing about our adventure, I had to tell her. What a magnificent journey, she said. If only I were a man, I would go with you. It is a journey worthy of the nephew of Professor Hardwigg. Oh, Harry Lawson, I envied you. I had expected that Gretchen would be against this mad journey, that she would beg me not to go, but her approval was the final blow. I returned home to find my uncle in a state of great activity. Hurry and get packed, he said. You are wasting time. We are really going, then? I asked, hoping he would give the journey some more thought. We leave the day after tomorrow at daybreak, he answered. We went by train from Hamburg, Germany to Copenhagen, Denmark, and from there by schooner to Reykjavik, Iceland. The trip was a hard one, the seas rough and wild. We spent most of our 11 days at sea in our cabins, sick and pale. When we docked, my uncle was so haggard he could scarcely climb to the deck. When he stepped out on the deck and looked around, however, his face brightened and he stood erect. He took my arm and held it tightly. Behold, he said, pointing to a high 2-peaked mountain in the distance. Behold, the gateway to the center of the earth, Mount Sneffels. I smiled weakly but said nothing. The worst difficulty is behind us, my uncle added, as we left the ship and headed for our hotel. How is the worst difficulty behind us? I asked with a cry. All we have to do now that we are here is to descend into the bowels of the earth, he answered matter-of-factly. I would remember his answer many times in the days to come. Later that night we had dinner with a Mr. Fridriksson, one of Iceland's most learned scientists. We told him nothing of our planned journey, explaining only that we were here as tourists. However, we did learn from him more of the story of Arne Sakisum, and what we learned made the reason for the coded parchment clear at last. My uncle had asked Fridriksson if the library in Reykjavik had any books written by Sakisum. You will not find any such books here in Iceland, nor anywhere else, the scientist said. Why not? My uncle asked. Because Sakisum was accused of heresy, of opposing the beliefs of the church, and in 1573 his books were all publicly burned. But to turn to a more pleasant subject, Professor Hardwigg, I hope you find time during your visit here to examine some of Iceland's minerals. Some fine examples are to be found on Mount Sneffels. I might consider visiting I might consider visiting here, said my uncle, barely hiding his delight. That will not be an easy trip, however, said Fredrickson. There are no boats to take you across the bay. You will have to go by land along the coast, but it is a very interesting route. To get there, you will need a guide, and I have just the man for you. I will bring him to your hotel tomorrow. The following morning, when I awoke, I heard my uncle's voice coming from the next room. I joined him and was introduced to a tall, strongly built man. His red hair was long, and his eyes were strong and intelligent. He seemed like a man who could be trusted. His name was Hans. Hans agreed to guide us to a village on the slope of Sneffels and remain in our service during my uncle's scientific investigation. Little did Hans realize at the time that he would make history with us by accompanying us to the center of the earth. We spent the next days getting our equipment together. Besides the normal climbing tools, pickaxes, crowbars, a ladder made of silk, iron-shod alpine poles, and strong rope, we took the following: a thermometer which would read to 150 centigrade, a manometer to measure atmospheric pressure, a good watch, 2 compasses, a night glass, and 2 lanterns, and a battery to give us light. Our arms consisted of 2 rifles and 2 6-shooters. I couldn't understand why we'd need them, for we had neither wild animals nor savage natives to fear. But I decided that my uncle had his reasons. The weather was overcast but calm when we began our journey to Mount Sneffels. What do I risk? I reasoned. We will take a walk and climb a mountain. If worst comes to worst, descend into the crater of an extinct volcano. It took a full 10 days to reach the foot of Mount Sneffels. My uncle and I rode horses. 2 more carried our equipment, but nothing could persuade Hans to climb on the back of any animal, so he made the trip on foot. Along the way, we had to cross small mountains and large ones, and flatlands and fjords, those swirling bodies of water surrounded by rocky cliffs thousands of feet high. Hans led the way in such an easy manner that I began to believe that he could indeed lead us anywhere, even to the center of the earth. We left the horses and began to climb Mount Sneffels in single file. Hans led the way along paths so narrow that 2 men could not pass. There was no time nor place for conversation, so we climbed in silence. As we advanced, the road became difficult. Rocks broke under our feet and went rushing off the side of the mountain into the plains below. The cold was intense. The wind blew violently. We had to avoid constant falls, yet Hans moved up the slope as if he were walking across a flat plain. We spent the first night on the side of the crater, too excited to eat or sleep. But sleep finally did come, and the morning brought a surprise when we looked up. We were near the summit of one of Mount Sneffels' 2 peaks. What do you call this peak? My uncle asked Hans. Scateris, he replied, with the usual one-word answer that was his way. A few more hours brought us to the summit and to the edge of the crater. I looked down into the inverted cone-shaped hole, half a mile wide, and thought, to descend into this crater is like descending into the interior of a cannon when it is loaded and ready to go off. This is the act of a madman, but I knew that I would soon do just that and felt like a lamb being led to slaughter. We began our descent into the huge cone-shaped crater, passing volcanic rocks and layers of deep soft snow. We were tied to each other by a long rope to prevent accidents. By midday, we were at the bottom of the crater, which was composed of 3 separate shafts. It was through these shafts that Sneffels, when it was erupting, sent up its burning lava and poisonous vapors. My uncle ran to examine each of the 3 shafts, breathless with delight. Hans, seated on a pile of lava, looked at my uncle as if he were a lunatic. Suddenly, my uncle uttered a wild, unearthly cry. Harry, Harry, come here quickly, this is wonderful. I ran to his side. Look there, he cried, pointing to a rock wall. I looked where he pointed. There, carved on the rock wall, was the name I had hoped never to see again, Arne Sakisum. End of chapter 2.